through all the technical issues and ready to get started. We'll start today with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we're on unceded ancestral lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Lakota, and Ute nations and peoples, along with 48 tribes to whom this land was and is home. We pay our respect to elders past and present, and all those who have stewarded this land for generations. This acknowledgement is also a commitment to work toward environmental justice and toward righting the wrongs of the past and present. We're so happy today to start with Pegah Jalali and Chris Stifler here with us from the Colorado Fiscal Institute. They wrote the very important report, Clearing the Air, the Real Costs and Benefits of Oil and Gas for Colorado. Pegah Jalali is Environmental Policy Analyst with Colorado Fiscal Institute. She's now a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, Seattle, and has written her dissertation on climate change mitigation policy and climate communication. At CFI, she works at the intersection of economic and climate issues, including federal and state oil and gas policies, transportation, and environmental equity. Chris Stifler is a senior economist at the Colorado Fiscal Institute. Chris has been working in the public policy and economic research business since 2012. He has appeared on National Public Radio, Colorado Public Radio's Colorado Matters, and KGNU's It's the Economy. His research has been cited in various publications like the Denver Post, the Colorado Independent, the Denver Business Journal, and by the Associated Press. Chris is also a part-time adjunct professor of economics at the University of Denver. Pegah and Chris will speak in turn, and we'll have the questions and answers after they're both finished with their presentations. Please welcome Pegah Jalali and Chris Stifler.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Heidi. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. And I started my presentation. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. As Heidi said, my name is Pegah Jalali. I'm an environmental policy analyst at Colorado Fiscal Institute, or CFI. CFI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we use research and advocacy to ensure that tax and economic policies in Colorado promote equity and widespread economic prosperity for all Coloradans. So in Colorado, our economy is very heavily dependent on our natural environment, and our outdoor recreation industry, our agriculture, and our tourism. And they are all being impacted by climate change, as you all know. And not only that, our whole economy is being impacted by climate change because it affects the health of the Coloradans. And at the end of the day, climate change is caused by burning of fossil fuels. So that's why CFI is interested in this issue, and it's one of our priorities. Colorado is number 5 in crude oil production and number 8 in natural gas production in the United States. But most of the times when we talk about the economic impacts of oil and gas, we usually mostly focus on jobs, on taxes that the oil and gas sector pays, but we kind of ignore the negative economic effects that oil and gas sector has because of the pollution and because of the climate change effects that it has. So today, my very short presentation is going to be about the real costs from oil and gas industry for Colorado. So the first thing that I want to talk about is air pollution from oil and gas sector. Oil and gas industry is the largest source of emissions of volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. VOCs and nitrogen oxides together contribute to the formation of ozone pollutions, which is a very serious problem, especially in the Front Range area of Colorado. So this graph is from the State Implementation Plan, or Ozone SIP, if you've heard about it, and it shows that the oil and gas sector in 2020 produced about 110 tons of VOCs per day and about 37 tons of nitrogen oxides per day in 2020. Oil and gas sector is also a large contributor to particulate matter pollution and other toxins such as benzene, PFAS, toluene. So these are all come with health costs to Coloradans. It has been estimated that the total cost of ozone pollution from oil and gas sector is going to be $100 to $180 million by 2025. And particulate matter pollution from oil and gas is going to contribute to 70 premature deaths in Colorado by 2025. So these are the health costs that can be quantified. There are a lot of health problems that have not been quantified for Colorado specifically, especially those that result from toxin emissions. These contribute to cancers, asthma, respiratory problems, heart problems, and mental health problems. So even though we don't have a dollar figure here, but these are significant costs and they are borne by Coloradans, especially those communities that live near oil and gas developments. And they are more likely to be communities of color and low-income people. So these are the actual real economic costs that we are all paying as Coloradans. And not only air pollutant, but also greenhouse gas emissions are an important part of the pollution associated with the oil and gas sector. So social cost of carbon is a dollar estimate of the economic cost that results from emitting 1 additional ton of carbon dioxide. And per Colorado law, the social cost of carbon is $68 per ton. So every additional ton of CO2 is going to cost us $68, especially in health damages. So what this graph is showing is the trajectory prediction of how much CO2 equivalent emissions, or basically greenhouse gas emissions, oil and gas sector is going to generate between 2020 and 2030. And we see that it's like in 2021, it's about 20 million metric tons. And in 2030, it's going to go down to 10 million metric tons. And when we add all this up over this 10-year period, we are going to have more than 200 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions from oil and gas sector. And just multiplying that number by the $68 social cost of carbon per ton, we are going to get the number of $13.6 billion over this period. So something more than $1 billion a year we are paying in economic damages just from greenhouse gas emissions from the sector. Another potential cost associated with the oil and gas sector is plugging abandoned wells. So operators are supposed to cap and clean up their wells when they reach the end of their life and they're not producing oil and gas anymore. But many operators just abandon the wells that they have profited from without paying for the cleanup and closure. And these become orphan or abandoned wells. Colorado has at least 215 orphan wells and 454 sites that are associated with them. We have 60,000 total unplugged wells, including those that are currently producing or stripper wells, etc. Half of these 60,000 unplugged wells are stripper wells. Stripper wells are the low producing wells that have very small profit margins, and they are often at the end of their lifespan. And they don't even pay severance taxes. So they are very high risk for becoming abandoned or orphaned. And it has been estimated that total cost of plugging all of these 60,000 wells is about $7 billion for Colorado. So currently we are paying those costs through the Orphan Well program, using a fee that oil and gas industry is paying to plug and abandon orphan wells. But this is a huge number, and if those fees are not sufficient, then the state and of course the communities are left with paying those costs. And another cost that's associated with greenhouse gas emissions is the cost of climate change. We are very familiar with droughts, floods, storms, and wildfires in Colorado that are a result of climate change. It has been estimated that the total costs of climate change or extreme weather events that are associated with climate change in Colorado between 1980 and 2022 is about $20 to $50 billion. So this is a total cost of all of these disasters. And this graph, it shows two things. These blue bars show the number of billion-dollar disasters, and we can see that from 1980 to 2022, the number of these events have increased significantly. And this purple line shows the average costs, and we can see that these costs have also increased significantly, and they are like in the range of billions of dollars every year. So these are the costs associated with the whole, all of the greenhouse gas emissions everywhere, not just from oil and gas industry. But oil and gas is not a small part in the US economy. United States is the second largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions, and oil and gas sector is responsible for 80% of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. So its role is not negligible. And in Colorado, 16% of our total greenhouse gas emissions are from oil and gas sector, just the production. So we can see that even though these $20 to $50 billion is not just associated with oil and gas in Colorado, but its role is pretty significant. So it just gives us a scale. There are several other costs that they are not necessarily quantified. Housing prices, for example, are estimated that those houses that are sited near the near drilling are up to 35% have less value than comparable housings. There's a lot of water use, especially in fracturing. It uses 1.6 million gallons of water per well for its lifetime. And then there's a lot of issues with habitat loss, fragmentation, loss of biodiversity. And it has been estimated that in the US, the costs of habitat fragmentation are about $4 billion. So there are several costs associated with oil and gas that are not necessarily quantified, but they are definitely significant. I'm going to end my presentation here. I'm a bit over time. Thank you so much for paying attention to my presentation, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, if it's okay, I'll have Chris give his part, and then people can ask both of you questions.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thanks, Pega. So she did the cost side of things to add to the discussion. The cost sides were never here talked about. My side of the project was talking about the economic benefits. And I learned a bunch from Pega. I learned a bunch about these orphan wells or abandoned wells and all these terms that she had to define for me. So I learned what zombie wells were, stripper wells, orphan wells. It's such a unique problem that we have our own terminology for those things. But my side of the project is the GDP, the jobs numbers, and how much tax revenue the oil and gas contributes to Colorado. So the first question was, how many jobs does the oil and gas industry add to the state of Colorado? So we pulled the quarterly census of employment numbers. The latest when we did this report several months ago was March 2022. And there are 5 big sectors in the oil and gas industry. This is the extraction, the well drilling, pipeline construction, oil and pipeline transportation, and support activities. So those are the wonky labor economic statistics categories. But the overall data is about 20,000 jobs in Colorado in 2022 came from the oil and gas industry. To give you an idea how big that is, there's 2.7 million jobs in Colorado last year. So the oil and gas industry makes up a little less than 1%, 0.7% of overall employment in Colorado. You can also have publicly available these wage data. So you can look at total wages in each of these sectors. And so the first quarter of last year, the industry paid about $950 million. To give you an idea, that was about 1.8% of overall quarterly wages in the state. So you're talking about 1% of jobs and wages in Colorado. Now that has drastically changed in the last 3 years. So the second graph on this slide pulls the March 2019 employment compared to March 2022. And you can see we've lost about 12,000 jobs in the oil and gas sector since bigger booming time before the pandemic. So that we had back in 2019, we had about 1.2% of jobs came from the oil and gas sector. To give you an idea of what they're paying in jobs, a lot of times there's the industry touts this idea that the average job in the oil and gas sector in Colorado pays like $130,000. Well, you can get to that number if you divide total wages by the number of jobs, but that kind of really masks what different types of jobs are paying. So what oil derrick operators make are different than extraction workers, which are different than the architects and engineers, and it's different than the first line supervisors and managers and the lawyers who work in the oil and gas industry. And so our report really looked at the wage data, particularly this distribution of wage data from the 10th percentile to the median wage to the 90th percentile. Just to give you an idea, the median wage in Colorado in 2021 was $47,940, so about $48,000. You can see like the median wage for a derrick operator is actually well below the average. But then again, you have a higher paying in jobs like architecture, engineering occupations, managers, sales related jobs are paying a lot more in the oil and gas industry. When we pull GDP numbers, just look at how big the size of our Colorado economy comes from the oil and gas industry. And again, we pulled those 5 big sectors in the oil and gas industry. You can see in 2021, that last bar on the chart there, it made up about 3.3% of the overall GDP of Colorado. So the overall size of the economy, 3.3% comes from the oil and gas industry. Now that's down from a higher percentage back in 2018 when the oil and gas was employing more people. It was a little bit bigger size of the economy. Back in 2018, it was about 5% of overall state GDP. And so we get the response is, yeah, okay, maybe it's only 3% of the economy, but it's a big part of the economy in certain counties. And so we wanted to look at which counties were heavily reliant upon oil and gas, particularly the property taxes. And so you can pull oil and gas assessed value by counties. About half of our counties have some oil and gas. 36 out of 64 of our counties have some oil and gas property. But you can see it's heavily concentrated in a couple of counties: Weld County, almost 44% of their property tax comes from oil and gas. You have Garfield County, and then you have some counties down in the Southwest, Dolores, La Plata, Montezuma, that are heavily reliant upon the oil and gas industry. And so what we did is we ran all that property tax data to answer the question, how many $1 million comes from the oil and gas industry? And so in 2021, $11.9 billion came from our local property taxes. That's property taxes on your home and businesses and casinos and oil and gas, everything made up $11.9 billion. Of that $11.9 billion, we estimated that about $621 million came from property taxes from the oil and gas industry. That was about 5.2% of overall property taxes. So it is a significant chunk of our property taxes, and it's a significant chunk of our counties, cities, and school district budgets. Just to remind you, we fund our schools basically with our state sources from the general fund and some other sources, and then your local property taxes in the district. Well, there's already a backfill mechanism. So for instance, if we would suddenly lose the oil and gas industry, there is kind of a mechanism in the school finance formula that would automatically backfill that lost local tax revenue for school districts. The state would be on the hook to backfill the cost of K-12 education. So there's sort of a backfill mechanism for that, but there isn't a backfill mechanism for things like county budgets or fire district budgets or city budgets or any other local government that's dependent upon property taxes. So transition away from oil and gas, legislators have to be cognizant about backfilling or supporting the budgets of Montezuma's county budget and the specific school districts in these high oil and gas concentrated property tax school districts. So our detailed report has all these school districts by how much tax revenue and what percentage of their tax revenue comes from oil and gas. But I like to teach people about the school finance formula because it could be a model through which we backfill from the state things like county budgets, fire district budgets, city and local government budgets. And so overall, the big number of how much total taxes in the state, it was about $958 million. Now, PEGA kind of addressed some of that money. It's hard to say that's really a benefit if it's really just cleaning up orphan wells and abandoned wells and plugging old wells. But the biggest benefit as far as taxes definitely come from the property tax side of things. About $621 million from the property tax side of things. And then the next biggest is that severance tax. That's a super volatile funding source. For instance, it was like $0 last year, but $300 million this year. So we average that out. It's about $150 million in severance tax over those two years. And so overall, yes, the industry does contribute a fair amount in taxes, but I don't think it's as much as people think. If you look at overall tax revenue, that's all cities, counties, school districts, tiny cemetery districts, any sort of local government or state government. Last year, in 2020, we collected about $79 billion. So still the oil and gas industry is only making up about 1.2% of overall state and local revenue. So no matter how you slice it, it's about 1%-ish of employment and wages. It's about 1% of total revenue, but it's a lot higher, about 5% of your local property taxes comes from the oil and gas industry. And with that, we'll open it up for questions for either the cost side of things and the environmental side for PEGA, or some of the fiscal and economic labor questions for me.
You can feel free to pop your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll try to monitor the participants for hands raised. And I'll just take this moment to thank PEGA and Chris just from the bottom of my heart for all of their work on this report and for being here tonight to talk with you all. I'm not seeing any hands. If you have your hand up and I don't see, oh, now I see one. Paul.
Yeah, I have a question for PEGA. And that has to do with, you showed numbers for social cost of carbon. You also showed costs for disasters in Colorado. And it seems like that's kind of double counting. So when you're counting the cost of oil and gas, it seems like you should do one or the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So social cost of carbon takes into account economic damages, especially health damages from oil and gas, from just greenhouse gas emissions. These are, and so the graph that I showed for greenhouse gas emissions and estimated the $13 billion was from between 2020 and 2030. The next graph that was for costs of disasters was between 1980 and 2022. So the times don't overlap and they are kind of slightly different things. So like a cost of a wildfire, a cost of a drought. So these are not necessarily included in the other figure.
Thank you, Pega. And I saw another hand up. Bobby Mooney, did you still have a question?
Oh, hi, thanks.
Hi.
I had a really similar question. That's funny. I was curious about the difference between the cost for those extreme weather events versus the social cost of carbon. So thanks for answering that already.
See one in the chat. Are there cost benefit analysis for renewable energy sectors similar to this analysis for comparison as we transition? Curious about jobs, wages, taxes, GDP, etc. Comparisons.
Yes, there are several cost benefit analysis for renewables, especially jobs and cost savings. I can share some. But CFI has not done any kind of this, but there are so many other organizations have done that. I can share some of the reports with Heidi if she can share with everyone.
Yes, and if you think of more questions later, just feel free to email me and I will get the questions to the panelists, and I'll also send out a follow-up email to everyone that attended. I saw that, and actually we're not going to have time for everyone's questions here, but I'll be saving the chat and you'll have a chance to ask your questions at some point. But I have two more hands there that I'm going to call on, and then we're going to move on to the next section. So Darlan and then Brian.
Thanks. This question is for Chris. You had mentioned that the average salary would be $135,000 for oil and gas workers, but the vast majority of jobs you were showing were much less than $135,000. What's the other side? What are the jobs that are skewing the average to actually be $135,000? Would it be more upstream, midstream, or downstream?
Yeah, good question. In the data that I pulled from the occupational employment statistics, you can pull like lawyers who specifically work in the oil and gas sector, or engineers and architects and frontline supervisors and managers. Those are the ones that have median incomes that are like 130. So it tends to be the manager side of things, the lawyer side of things, and the engineer architect side of things. I'm surprised to see how little, on average, oil derrick operators and roustabouts and the average excavation support workers actually make.
Yeah, great question. And Brian also has a question.
Hey, thank you. My computer died right when the Q&A started, so I'm not sure if this was already asked, but my question was about the plug-in and abandoned wells. That $7 billion figure, was that the total potential cost if all of them need to be plugged and abandoned by the state, or just the likely ones? Yeah, I'm wondering how that breaks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the $7 million is like when all of these wells are eventually going to reach the end of their production life, right? So this is an estimate of like the cost of plugging all of these wells and cleaning up all of these 60,000 sites. Not that the state has to pay that, but just an indication of the scale of the cost. So if we fail to hold the operators and the industry accountable for paying these costs, then it would be a burden to all Coloradans. We're going to have to pay it with our tax dollars.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I did see another question. I don't think we really have time for it, but this is a super important question. How could we potentially replace, that 1% in taxes or that 1% in employment? And let's save that for the moment. Unless, Chris, you think you have a super quick answer for that.
Point to the fact that the industry has fallen in the last 3 or 4 years since COVID. And so if you wanted to give it some data on what does the phase out look like, we kind of have phased out a little bit. I mean, we've lost 12,000 of our jobs. We've lost a chunk of our economy. We've lost a chunk of our property taxes. But it's interesting that totals are still going up. So even if we lost a ton of our oil and gas industry, total jobs in the state's still going up. Even we lost a bunch of our total property taxes are still going up. And so is GDP. So if you kind of can look at a little bit of a phase out and kind of get the idea of what happened in the last 3 years.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've already kind of seen what will happen as oil and gas is already in decline. Okay, I'm sorry, we don't have time for all the questions right now. If we have more time at the end, we'll see. Otherwise, we'll try to capture it later through email. Our next section is on legislation. So many of you may have heard that the United Nations Environment Program has said that we need to stop all new fossil fuel development if we want to keep warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I don't know about you all, but it's very reassuring to learn that doing this in Colorado would only take a small nibble out of our economy and we'll be able to adjust. The local data, as Chris has said, supports the idea that there are some counties that will need support through this transition. So the legislation that we'll be talking about today will be legislation on how we might possibly address phasing out fossil fuel or oil and gas production, as we know we must, and how we might support those communities. And next, I'd like to introduce former Senator Mike Foot, who was a state legislator for 8 years, where he built coalitions and the necessary expertise to pass over 70 bills into law in a wide variety of subject matter areas. He focused on energy and environmental laws and state agencies implementing those laws, such as the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission, the Public Utilities Commission, and the Air Quality Control Commission. Several of his bills became model legislation for other states. He now represents individuals, nonprofits, community groups, and municipalities on environmental, energy, elections, and land use issues. And we're especially happy that he's 350 Colorado's lobbying advocate at the Capitol. Welcome to Mike Foot.
All right, thank you very much, Heidi. Thanks for everyone for joining. I guess before I get started, because I don't want to forget, it does appear we have a current legislator on here, and that's Representative Dixon. I wanted to recognize her and thank her for being here and joining us. And Heidi, I'm not even sure if it's in the agenda, and I'm not even sure Representative Dixon wants to say anything, but if she does, maybe we should make sure we have that opportunity sometime in the near future.
Excellent. Yeah, let me take advantage of this. I did not see you here, Representative Dixon, and I had actually emailed her earlier because we had planned to have Rep. Amabile here to talk about the workforce transition bill. Are you able to speak about that today, Representative Dixon?
Yes.
Wonderful. So we'll just start with Mike talking a little bit about potentially how can we address phasing out oil and gas permitting, and then we'll move on to you talking about the workforce transition bill. We're going to kind of try to keep it short because we lost some time at the beginning with some technical issues. So Take it
Yeah.
away, Mike.
Happy to keep it short for sure, Heidi. Thanks again. I wanted to just go over a little bit of a concept that we've been working on, and hopefully that the legislature will take up during the course of this session. And I'll precede it by saying that the way that I usually like to put it to folks, based on the years of experience that I had in the legislature as a legislator and now starting as a lobbyist for public interest environmental matters, is that I feel like one of the best ways to talk about it is that legislators and the legislature in general is kind of like human nature, in that most people don't really like to change, and certainly don't like to change very quickly. And so I think you have to really keep that in mind when you're talking about legislators and legislature in general. That doesn't mean that change doesn't happen. It certainly has over the last 4 to 5 years. And certainly when you look back at what's been happening, particularly since 2019, there's been a lot of change in the aggregate, but it's almost like you have to take steps, kind of 1 or 2 steps at a time. But then over the course of a couple of years, you look back and you've taken a lot of steps. And that's, I think, the way that I like to talk about it, at least in my opinion, the way that it works. And it's almost like another way maybe that I think about it is that it's almost like changing your diet. I mean, one day you could wake up on New Year's Day and say, I'm just going to stop eating carbs, and that's going to be my resolution. That probably won't work very well. It probably won't stick very much. But maybe if you don't eat donuts, or you cut out chips after that, and before long you've made some progress, and maybe you are eating a lot less carbs. That's, I think, kind of the way the legislation will typically work, particularly when you're talking about changes in energy and oil and gas. Colorado, despite the raw numbers that we heard and the really good information we heard from CFI, Colorado has been on a pretty steady diet of fossil fuels for a long time. And there's certainly a perception, at least at the Capitol, that exists today, that fossil fuels are a really important part of the economy. And frankly, to those that work in the area, it is an important part of the economy. But as Heidi mentioned, certainly all the science shows us at this point that we have to be getting off of fossil fuels sooner rather than later in order for us to have a livable climate. And so one of the premises of this bill that I'll talk about in just a second is that we're kind of taking that first step. We're introducing the legislature. We hope to introduce legislators and legislature to the idea that, hey, at some point in time in the near future, we won't be drilling for oil and gas, or at least we shouldn't be if we want to make sure we have a livable planet. This is a foreign idea, I think, to many, that we would actually at someday, stop permitting oil and gas. And it's pretty unlikely that an idea of saying, we're going to stop permitting oil and gas next year is going to fly in a place like the legislature. But the idea here is to introduce a bill that ties the ultimate cessation of oil and gas permitting to legislative oversight through what's called the SMART Act. The SMART Act is legislative oversight. As you all know from high school civics, the legislature has oversight over the executive branch. And part of its oversight is that the executive branch has to report what they're doing, how they're addressing issues, what they think things look like for their agency over the next year. And what we're hoping to do is introduce the idea and pass a bill that actually all of the agencies that are involved with oil and gas permitting have to look at the possibility that sometime in the near future, there won't be any oil and gas permitting. So what is that going to look like for the agency? Going back to a little bit to the CFI's presentation, what does it look like when that revenue that does exist, when that goes away? What is it going to look like with their full-time employees? How are they going to deal with the fact that those full-time employees aren't going to have any work to do anymore? How are they going to shift it? In other words, kind of do a little bit of medium-term planning. What does your agency look like when this permitting needs to stop, when the permitting does stop? Maybe the permitting stops because there's legislation that ultimately stops it. Maybe it just stops because the market is such that fossil fuels aren't as necessary anymore. Who knows why it would stop? But if it does stop, we need to make sure that the state is planning for that. And so part of that is legislative oversight to have the executive branch agencies talk about what it would look like. And that would be, it's actually a fairly not complicated thing to stick into the SMART Act. And that's part of what we are trying to get done. And it's awaiting approval right now from the leadership in the Senate to be able to run that bill. We have a Senate sponsor that's more than willing to do that. So we're hoping that'll happen. Getting a little anxious, frankly, because it's February 21st and the session's been going on for 6 weeks and it only can go on for 4 months. And so we want to make sure we can kind of get that out there and get the discussion going. But it's really kind of a first step in getting rid of that, the carbs in the diet and the fossil fuel addiction, I guess, for a better way to look at it. And hopefully we can use that to get have the discussion go forward and put us in a better place in the very near future. So that's, I think, Heidi, that'll be kind of the extent of my summary of it. But I know that you wanted me to kind of stick around for the just transition summary and then also for Q&A, and I'm of course happy to do that. And again, thanks to everybody for being here. And hopefully when you see this kind of thing come out or any kind of a bill that you think pushes the ball forward when it comes to climate action, please don't be passive about it. Please actually contact your legislators. You have a House representative and a senator, and let them know that you support these things. I think that really matters when their constituents reach out to them. So thanks again for having me, and happy to take Q&A a little bit later.
Thank you so much, Senator Foot. And we will keep everybody updated on the progress of that bill that's being proposed. And we'll turn it over next to Representative Dixon to talk about the bill that she's co-sponsoring.
Thanks, Heidi, and thanks for putting this together, and thanks to Mike for your summary of that bill. I am here to talk about House Bill 1074, which I am co-priming with Representative Judy Amabile of Boulder. And I guess I should probably introduce myself. Hi, I'm Ruby Dixon. I am the state representative from District 37, which is Greenwood Village and Centennial, so South Metro area. And I am professionally, I'm an economist. I work in philanthropy and charity work, and a lot of what I do is analytics of charitable and philanthropic work in the climate space. So I'm very interested in the data related to this, and was very interested in that CFI presentation that I got to see some of. So thank you for that. But yes, so the bill that I'm running with Representative Amabile is a study bill. So it's just authorizing the Office of the Future of Work to start actually working on the questions of what are we going to do to help workers who are displaced or whose jobs are significantly altered by the transition away from oil and gas, and then also by automation. So it includes automation for several reasons, but for today, I'll mostly just talk about the oil and gas part. So as Mr. Stifler's presentation showed, there is a pretty substantial oil and gas industry in Colorado. It is not as big as it was at its zenith, but it's still definitely a pretty substantial employer of a lot of people. And those jobs are spread out across the state. There's jobs in urban areas, in suburban areas, and in very rural areas. So this is really a matter where a lot of people across the state are concerned about it. And not just for the loss of the tax base, although that's certainly an important thing to consider when we have very limited resources in the government in Colorado, but also, of course, the well-being of these people and these communities, and making sure we understand what's going to happen and what are the routes to help these people out. So the bill that we're running is a pretty simple study that just authorizes this office to work with external stakeholders to come up with a plan for what we're supposed to do about all of this. It will involve talking to a lot of different types of people. When we were writing this bill, we stakeholdered with, environmental groups, of course, with labor groups, with localities, with all sorts of different people to really understand what sort of information would you need, and how do we get it into this bill in a way that is as tight as possible. To make sure that we're really giving the office a clear mandate so that they understand what information to give to us. And the hope is that we will have at least preliminary results from that study before likely not this next legislative session, but the following legislative session, so that we can start hopefully pretty quickly getting recommendations from this study and putting it into effect, so we can understand, what resources do workers need to transition from their oil and gas job into, let's say, renewable energy jobs, or potentially non-energy related jobs. Or, as we've been talking about, plugging wells and other jobs that remediate some of the damages of the fossil fuel industries. There's a lot of different possibilities for these workers, but there hasn't been a ton of work in Colorado to determine what specific opportunities there are for transitioning, what regulatory things might need to be altered to make it easier, what training would be most useful to really bridge people from one career into another, those kind of things. So there's been a lot of work that was done on that bill on the front end. We got it introduced, and then we passed it out of the business committee a few weeks ago unanimously. So we got full bipartisan support of that entire committee, which was really exciting, and I think really shows just how much of a statewide issue this is, and just how much Republicans and Democrats alike want to make sure we're tackling this problem. It's now going to the Appropriations Committee, where basically they'll just decide whether we have the money for it this year. But I really appreciate those of you, I see some of you on the call who showed up to testify in support of that bill. And it was really helpful, I think, having that much testimony from people all across the spectrum, from labor to enviros to locals to experts, was really helpful, just to make sure that it wasn't just being seen as one thing, because this has importance for all sorts of different people. So thank you to those of you who supported it in that committee hearing. And we're really pretty excited about moving forward on it. And I can take questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Representative Dixon. And we will keep everybody posted on when is needed for more testimony in the future. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to introduce you properly, Rep. Dixon. But thank you so much for being here on last minute notice. I really, really appreciate it. And are there any questions for either of the legislators before we move on to the next section?
I have something, if there are no questions. So that study bill has already made its way through the first committee, and typically there's not further testimony in the Appropriations Committee. But I would love if you guys are interested in helping out with future legislation. I'm very interested in climate policy and energy policy. So you'll probably see several more bills from me in this space. A bill potentially on geothermal, and potentially, well, actually, I already just introduced a bill on carbon management. So if those ideas interest you, or if you just want to see, climate legislation, I'd love to hear from you. And I would love if you'd be interested in showing up to testify on some of these bills.
Great, thank you. And I now see two hands. We'll take those two questions and then we will move on to the next section. So Paul Coleman, I think I saw your hand first, and then Steffi Weisberg.
Thanks, Heidi. Thank you, Rep. Dixon and Mike Foot, as always. Would you mind putting the link to the bills in the chat so we can actually pull them up?
Yeah, there is a link to that bill in the chat with the amendments if you go up, or maybe Ruth can post it again in the chat.
All right, thank you.
And then Steffi.
Hi, I'm from, let me move my thing over so you can see. I'm from 315 New Mexico, and in our legislature, we had a wonderful bill somewhat similar to this for a just transition office, whole division actually. And it's just been trashed. It was that section was brought into a larger bill that has a lot of carbon capture and hydrogen. And I noticed that those were some of the amendments that you have in this bill. So I'm wondering, my question is, how much are you having to compromise on those issues, which are going to be just allowing the, natural gas infrastructure to continue on and on?
Great question. Thanks, Steffi. So a lot of these bills come from a very robust process of talking to every stakeholder that we can, that we think is interested in working on this. But in terms of forced compromise, I haven't really seen a ton of that here. The amendments that were brought on this bill were brought by myself and my co-prime Judy Amabile, partially because the workers that are working in these industries suggested that they were particularly helpful for, or particularly appropriate for the skill sets that they already have. And it's, this is a study bill, and it's worth kind of looking into whether it works to try to transition workers to clean industries that are appropriate for their existing skill sets and potentially utilize existing infrastructure for a much cleaner purpose. So that was something that came from that stakeholding process, but also something that Representative Amabile and I are pretty excited about. And then, as you heard, I am also running a bill on carbon management to try to look into whether it makes sense in Colorado, what technologies within carbon management are verifiable and appropriate in this context, and that we can actually rely on, because as I'm sure many of you know, most climate scientists don't think that we're going to be able to hit our goals without having a plan for this stuff in place. So it's worth starting to actually look into it. But in Colorado, in terms of the Office of Just Transition, we're lucky that we already have an Office of Just Transition. It exists. It is working. They are doing a lot of stakeholding, but they have been mostly focused on coal in Colorado. And so this bill is trying to make sure we're expanding the conversation, so it's not just about coal.
Thank you, Rep. Dixon. I'm going to have to move us along, but I see Senator Foot wanted to put a word.
Yeah, real quick, Steffi, I don't know anything about the New Mexico bill. What I'll say here, though, is that I think the representatives have done a really good job of a reframing of the way that it's being talked about. Unfortunately, just transition in Colorado, as well as elsewhere, I think, has been politicized and turned into, from some folks, kind of a bad thing. And so this bill specifically talks about, it goes into the Office of Future Work, and it also includes things like job displacement from automation. And so it broadens things a little bit. It certainly does include oil and gas, which is one of our main interests in it. But to the extent perhaps that it comes out of the just transition frame that I think in some way has been poisoned a little bit by the opposition, you might find some more success there. But that's coming from someone that doesn't know anything about the bill you're talking about.
Great, thank you for that perspective. Next, we've got to put a personal face on the impacts of oil and gas in our state. Our next guest is Patricia Garcia Nelson, who was born and raised in northern Colorado. Her family has lived in Greeley since her parents immigrated from Mexico in the late 1970s. Her son Diego is a student at Bella Romero Academy, where the construction of a 24 oil well pad site has been approved, less than 700 feet from the playground. She was the sole parent plaintiff in a case against the COGCC, the Oil and Gas Commission, and Extraction Oil and Gas for the approval of the permits. For years, she's worked with 350 Colorado, Colorado Rising, Safe and Healthy Colorado, Weld Air and Water, and other organizations to raise awareness about Bella Romero and residential drilling. She is the Colorado Fossil Fuel Just Transition Advocate for Green Latinos and also serves on the board for 350 Colorado. She's an amazing advocate for justice and the environment in our state, and I'm so happy to welcome her here today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And I just want to thank Heidi for all the work that she's been doing. There's so much work that happens behind the scenes, and Heidi just stays on top of everything. And she keeps all of us on track as well. So thank you for all the work that you're doing, Heidi. And I'm really excited about the report that's been released, simply because for far too long, our communities have been told that, our fears, sometimes outright, that our fears are unfounded. But at the end of the day, this report is really showing what we've been saying for years at this point. And so for me personally, I know that I've already been sending out the report to my networks. I've been citing this resource as a reason why we should be working towards a just transition and a transition off of fossil fuels. So I'm really excited to have this report. And as Heidi mentioned, I've been working against oil and gas operations at my son's school for almost 5 years now. And so I really appreciate the amount of data that's coming out, because that's also what we've been told, is that, there isn't anything to support our claims. And it's so important to have reports like these to be able to support our claims. And so I'm sorry, Heidi, I wasn't too sure how much into the story you wanted me to get tonight.
Oh, well, do you want to share a little bit of the story? That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, for
people can
sure.
understand what you and your community have been going through.
Yeah, so this fight really began even before I moved back to Colorado from where I lived in Louisiana. And all of this happened in 2013 when Mineral Resources, which then turned into Extraction Oil and Gas and now is Civitas, wanted to put in at that time it was a 64 well pad behind a school. And it was one of the groups that I was working with, Well Dare and Water, who really rallied up the parents. And it was the moms that organized and talked to the operator directly. So at the time in 2013, Mineral Resources released a report where they showed that having an installation near a playground was too close and not suitable for development. Now, the distance behind the playground and where the site would have been was a little over 1,250 feet. And what happened is, after deciding not to put the site there, they decided to choose one of their alternative sites, and their alternative site was behind Bella Romero Academy, where they leased land off of a property owner. And so there really was no mechanism at the time for community groups to protest the legality of those permits, because this was all on private property. And so one of the starkest differences that we saw was that the demographics of those kids at this school were literally black and white. And so the majority of the students at our school identify as Hispanic Latino. There's a high population of immigrants and refugees. And at the end of the day, I really feel that this company did what it always did. They did what they always do, and they took advantage of our communities. And what happened between 2017, when they applied and were granted their 2A permits to drill, and until now, there has been the lawsuit that I was a part of, where we have given some legal precedents for community groups to sue and bring permits up for judicial review. Working with 350 Colorado, we applied for and received a $500,000 EPA grant for community air monitoring. And this is just the beginning. And ultimately, the goal is to shut down the wells at Bella Romero. And it's going to take a lot of work. And again, I appreciate the information that's available, because one of the reasons they gave us to why this project was approved and why it needed to move forward was the amount of money that it was going to bring into our community. The administrators were told that there would be built a sports field facility for the school. They were told that we would get sidewalks. I mean, this school has been there for well over a decade, and the children don't even have sidewalks. And so when we talk about the costs, those are some of the things that are the real costs. And right now, I mean, we're it takes a lot of work because I mean, I take my kid to school, and if I see any activity on the site, you know, I take part of my day to take pictures and try to document as much as I can. I try to call, you know, allies from Earthworks to try to get some OGI when we see, you know, that there's any movement on the site. Because for the longest time, since these wells were installed since 2018, we've been told that there's no reason to worry. And time again, we have seen that there are not just state monitors picking up. There's the CSU monitors that we've been able to have positioned near the school in the meantime until we get the EPA monitors going. There's so much going on. And at the end of the day, this kind of information is so important. The numbers and the data is so important because, I mean, I can't even go to the nail salon without just randomly talking to a woman whose child also goes to my son's school, and he's lost 25 pounds and no doctor can tell her what's wrong with her son. And that's just one of the many stories that I've had parents, but that's for me is the most shocking. I can't even go to the nail salon and relax without having this be in my face. And like I said, this is the reality of my community. We have been told that it doesn't matter that we want air monitors. The state said it's okay. And that's a direct quote from our school spokespeople. So again, I'm really grateful to CFI for putting this report together. And yeah, that's where we are right now.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for sharing your story and for all the fighting that you've been doing. Just appreciate you so much. Does anybody have any questions before we go to the next section? Patricia, you were also instrumental in getting that grant from the EPA, weren't you? Yeah.
It was definitely a team effort. There is Riley, that's our Northern Colorado team coordinator. There's Jenna, that's a PhD student. And there were several other people that worked really, really hard. There was Deb. I mean, there's so many people that worked on this, but that was really our core team. And so it's really amazing. And being able to get that experience is also something that we can take into other communities, especially now that the EPA is also pushing really, you know, there really is a reckoning going on with environmental justice, and to be able to have the knowledge and experience to put together such a complicated grant, like I said, it's going to be huge to be able to take this to other communities. I do work for Green Latinos, and part of that is going into other communities and hearing what their priorities are. And I really feel like with this experience that I gained with 350, I can go into communities across the state and let them know that they can do it. And I know they can because we were able to do it.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much for all of your work.
Thank you, Heidi. You're so great. Heidi's amazing, you guys.
Next, we're going to be hearing more about impacts of fracking and also climate change in general from Dr. Claire Burchanel. And I'm sorry, I probably pronounced your name wrong. I should have made sure of that before we started, but she is a resident in pediatrics at the University of Colorado and Children's Hospital Colorado. She cares for children in a wide variety of settings, and she's working to address the impact of climate change on child health. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Heidi, and thanks for having me. This has been really wonderful to hear all these perspectives. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up just a few slides. Okay, and Heidi, can you let me know if you can see these?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, let me.
You can see all the.
Yeah, just start up. Okay. So this really, this presentation, we got a great overview about some of the health impacts, specifically in Colorado from Pega in the beginning, which was wonderful. And so this will be kind of starting broad, thinking about the impact that climate change on health. I imagine that most of the people who are on this webinar have an understanding that climate change is bad for human health, probably, or else you wouldn't be here. But talking a little bit more about the specific things that we're worried about. And then speaking a lot more specifically about air pollution, since that's one of, but not the only health consequence of the oil and gas production. And then we'll look a little bit more at some of the data around oil and gas, specifically on human health, and looking in Colorado and some of the evidence we have. So I like to start off with Ed Maybach at George Mason's University for Center for Climate Change and Communication. He likes to distill how we communicate about climate change into 5 key points. And I think it's really nice just to kind of keep things really simple. So we know that this is something that's happening. It's us. So it's caused by human behavior and it's affecting us. There's a wide scientific consensus that it's happening. And then 4, which I'll talk about, we're kind of talking about today, is that it's bad. And then leaving with on a note of there being hope. So I think it's always good to end with hope. And some of that is what we're talking about with this legislation. Okay. Okay, so we know climate change is harmful for human health. So talking about this is from the CDC. So thinking about, we talked about some of the things in terms of disasters, air pollution, but thinking that, globally, there's a huge impact. So severe weather, air pollution, increased risk of infectious diseases, worsening allergens, which contributes to respiratory disease, water quality, our nutrition in terms of agriculture that had come up in the chat earlier, and then in general, overall conflict, mental health, and extreme heat. And thinking about Colorado specifically, we are seeing, we really struggle with air pollution overall. And that's something that the oil and gas industry does contribute to, which we'll talk about, and then extreme heat as well. And I think it's really important. And we talked about this in Pega's presentation about when we think about oil and gas, part of it is the local health impacts, and we'll kind of talk about those differences, but also how it contributes to the greenhouse gas effect. And so anytime we're thinking about any of this output, we're talking about these major big picture impacts on climate change, which is making human health worse. This is just another figure kind of breaking it down in terms of the things that we are worried about, and just keeping in mind that these are things that we are seeing now. This is not something that's just in the future. And specifically, we've talked a lot about the idea of environmental justice. And so I don't think we can talk about climate change or air pollution or oil and gas without talking about environmental justice, knowing that the burden of the impact of climate change on health really falls on populations that are already the most vulnerable. And so, who are the populations that are vulnerable? So as a pediatrician, I am very concerned about children. And so we know that, the World Health Organization had said that, 88% of the burden of this disease is going to be on children less than 5 years old, right? And some of that is because they are, their bodies are still developing. They're just in general more vulnerable. We also know older adults, people with disabilities, you can kind of see this list. And then specifically focusing on low income, low educational attainment, racial ethnic minorities. These are populations that have already been oppressed in society that then are having to deal with the consequences of climate change on health. And then specifically, we'll be talking, with oil and gas, thinking about communities that are living on the front line, like the stories we heard, and then the occupational risks of the workers themselves who are working. So just briefly to talk about air pollution, since oil and gas does contribute to this. I think it's really striking when we look at the, globally that, air pollution, which is it's indoor and outdoor in this case, but is really the 4th leading cause of death more worldwide. And so I think sometimes when we think about this, it's good to keep this in mind that this is something that has a huge impact. And that, it's kind of complicated because in a lot of ways, our air quality, we'd seen some graphs earlier, has improved, right? The Clean Air Act in 1970 was hugely impactful. But we know that, the EPA says that over 60%, so the vast majority of children are living in areas where pollutant concentrations are to the point that are impacting health. And that really, we think that because air pollution and climate change sort of work together in a vicious cycle, that we expect air pollution to be getting worse. And so thinking specifically about oil and gas, this is an image. The next couple of slides are from a presentation that was done by some individuals at the University of Colorado. So it's very local, and it was published in 2022, so just last year. And this, obviously, I am presenting the health perspective. I'm not an expert in sort of how oil and gas happens, but this is just to show you kind of all the different stages and all the different kind of hazardous chemicals and things that are going out into the air that come from all these ones. And also just to say, when we study these things, it's complicated because there's so many different aspects. So, we are the most worried about this because, we know that people who live near oil and gas sites are exposed to known toxic pollutants. And some of these, particulate matter is something that we have good evidence, and some of that I'll share about, that these things are dangerous for human health, and that there is a huge burden of people. So 18 million Americans live within a mile, which is known to be a significant amount of distance, and that overall this is growing. Although we have talked about in Colorado, some of, in terms of the somewhat a slight decline, at least in terms of the employment stuff. And then big picture, when we talk about climate change, the release of methane contributes to climate change overall. So anytime we talk about the health consequences, really thinking about contributing to climate change and all those effects we talked about earlier. And so this is really talking about, so not just how it contributes to climate change, but really the local effects. So the effects that we know that oil and gas production has on the local communities. We have, studies that show it affects our brain and nervous systems, contributes to increased respiratory disease. I see that in kids who are coming in with asthma, worsening asthma, increased lifetime risk of cancer as well, established from some of these more toxic chemicals. And then there's a lot of data out there that I'll show you about the effect on fetal development. So in terms of babies, being at higher risk of being born early, being born small, which are all things that lead to, higher risk of health effects later in life. And then overall, just premature mortality. So dying before they otherwise would have because of this exposure. And then, a sense of just overall decreased well-being, right? So the stress that can come from living near this industry, and then also needing to use healthcare more, which is something, when we talk about the cost specifically coming from that, right? And so this is from that same paper, and really just overviews, but you can just see these are all different publications in the literature that are showing kind of from these different chemicals. So, we had talked about earlier the volatile organic compounds, and then sulfur dioxide. These were all things that Pega mentioned in her presentation. Ground level ozone is known to be harmful. And then you can see methane here in terms of acceleration of climate change. And so this is a lot of words. The main thing I wanted to focus on here, this is kind of an overview of how we study this and looking at this. And when we think about human exposures here in the middle, just that, we talk a lot about air pollution, but also water pollution, soil contamination, the physical hazards. So thinking about noise, vibration, light are all things that are also harmful to human health. And then thinking about the impact on the community and the built environment. So, green space, traffic patterns, and then just overall, the cumulative impact of communities who live here, over a lifetime, of these, a buildup of these chemicals and the impact that has on health. And then over on the far right side, these are a lot of the specifics about risk of, with pregnancy outcomes and health effects. Specifically, this is just a map, so you can just see that Colorado is very much kind of on the front line in some of these areas that we talked about earlier, up in northern Colorado, really high density of wells. And so thinking specifically about Colorado, this was a study published in 2020, but just looking at how this is increased and how many Coloradans are at risk, which is a very significant number. And then this, I just think, is really important. These are studies pulled from the literature, these were all done in Colorado. So it's been really impressive to see that so much of the research around the negative health impacts of oil and gas are being done here, because there is so much of an impact on Coloradans in general. So you can see noise pollutions, cardiovascular disease, birth outcomes, and then looking at the mental health impacts from this. And so I'll leave with, we talked about ending with hope. So this is a study that looked specifically at particulate matter. So not looking at all the different, pollutants coming from oil and gas, but just was a nice example, I thought, of, transitioning to clean energy, cleaning up our air specifically has, measurable impacts on decreasing, premature deaths and saving a large amount of money. Really, and that the benefits would be primarily local. So the communities who are most vulnerable would see those benefits, and that some of these benefits would be immediate, in addition to kind of mitigating the impact of global warming. So I think all the things that we're talking about in terms of a just transition, this is all sort of evidence that contributes to that. So these, that's pretty much what I have. Happy to answer any questions or send out any resources.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. And when we release the video, everybody will be able to, get a closer look at the slides. Before we take questions, I just want to put a few things in the chat real fast, because I don't want to take too much time here. I want to leave it for questions. But here is a support letter to support the concept of a phase out of oil and gas with a just transition, if you would like to sign that if you have not already. And then I also want to announce that we're having a messaging campaign, and I want to share my screen to an invitation to a party, an action party, and then we'll go back to questions. So we are putting on an action party, No New Fracking 2030 action party, and this will be with multiple allies. I'm reaching out to allies right now, but we are we're in planning for the party already, March 19th, 6 to 9 p.m. Save the date. There will be a lot of action stations where you can take action. And then also please email me if you would like to be on a list of people to receive notifications with new social media posts that you can share. I'll put my name in the chat here, and then we'll go back to questions. And how do I pronounce your name? We only communicated by email, everyone, so I was embarrassed not to know.
That's okay. It's Birchinal.
Birchinal.
Yeah.
So thank you so much to Dr. Birchinal. And I see a hand up from Darlan Chang.
Thanks. My question is about the recent national news about gas stove cooking and its effects on children's asthma. Have you gotten more questions lately by concerned parents about how gas stove cooking could affect their children's risk for asthma?
Yeah, it definitely comes up a lot. People are talking about how gas stoves are smoking. It's been very controversial, and that the evidence is pretty good. I've heard that the industry is kind of trying to push back and say that the studies weren't well done, but our school of public health here has kind of looked at the studies and said they're well done and they're robust. So I think the biggest thing that I talk to families about is really ventilation. So a big part of it is if your house is well ventilated and kind of having fans on and stuff like that, that can help mitigate some of the effects, but certainly contributes to respiratory disease. Yeah. All the more reason to transition to electric.
Definitely. Other questions about health impacts? And we can also take questions for the other people if you felt like you still had questions left. Paul Coleman.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. Thank you, Dr. Birchinal. You just hit us with a fire hose of information, and wonder if there's a place where we can go to consume it at a leisurely pace.
Yeah, well, we can, I'm happy if Heidi wants to send out the slides. I can also put together some resources for kind of some kind of high yield places to get a lot of this information. Even just sending out some of the articles. There's like a lot of nice review articles about the impact of oil and gas specifically, or looking more at air pollution. So if we send out the slides, I have all the links and articles that are in there for you to look at your leisure.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that offer. And I'll definitely do a follow-up email to everybody with information and further links that you can go to. Brian Hedden.
Hey, thank you so much. This is an amazing presentation. I'm really grateful and impressed with all the information, and I'm excited to dive back in on the replay and the slides. Hopefully they'll be available too, maybe. And my question is somewhat tangential, but it's something that's been nagging at me that I was just reminded of is the PUC in Colorado recently raised the rate of gas. And I'm wondering if anybody has insight about like, is that a political move? Is that an economic move? Like that seems to be pretty related to this issue. And I'm not sure how related it is. If anybody has insight on that.
Yeah, I think it's all related. We're more right now focusing on the extraction part of it in this webinar, but definitely I'll try to follow up with you later.
Thanks. Cool. Yeah. Thanks. Appreciate that. The idea.
Yeah, I can make a real brief comment on that.
Okay.
The PUC allows Excel to pass on all their costs to the customers. And so all this gas rate hike, most of it comes under the category of passing on the cost. So Excel doesn't really have a good incentive to control their costs because we pay for them all. And that's the root of the problem.
Cool.
Yeah, and Wes Wilson, I see your hand up, and I'm just going to also point out in the chat that reports have been coming out about PFAS, which are forever chemicals being used in drilling. And unfortunately, they actually, for years, have not had to disclose what chemicals they use. And moving on to Weston Wilson's question.
Oh, thanks, Heidi. Yeah, I have a question for Claire Burchell. How do you pronounce it? I'm wondering how you and your medical colleagues are reacting to so much peer-reviewed information of harms from oil and gas emissions, in contrast to the Environmental Protection Agency and CDPHE declaring that those levels of concentrations are not harmful. Patricia made that beautiful point. That's what happened to them at Bella Romero. The state came up with their camel, didn't find concentrations to be harmful. And that's what's going on throughout the United States. What do you and your colleagues make of that dilemma?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the first thing I would say is I think most of my colleagues, to be perfectly honest, are not aware. Just in general, the medical community overall, I mean, they may say just general, but it's not something we're taught in medical school. You know, a lot of this, the climate change work I've had to learn on my own, and I'm actually working to develop a curriculum for pediatricians. I think there's a general sense that air pollution isn't, is harmful, but it's not something that's necessarily built into our care, generally. But I think it's hard when there is sort of a sense of cognitive dissonance, right? When you see what's happening in the literature, right? We have this really robust data, but then you're seeing that policies don't reflect that. And I think that's a lot of reasons why physicians are working harder to get involved in this work and using our voices, because it's something that we're seeing every day. But I think a lot of us in a lot of areas of advocacy, healthcare professionals, we kind of stay in our lane, right? And so I think it's a big push to get this information out there and use this voice to kind of help push policy in the right direction. So I completely agree with that gap.
Thank you for that. And please don't stay in your lane. The community needs a much more robust reaction from the medical community. Principally we work with PSR and they're doing a significant job on that. But what's happening in Colorado is that all those studies you cite from McKinsey particularly, they're epidemiological, statistical. The state doesn't accept it. They disregard that as improper science.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question and comment there, Wes.
Thank you, Heidi.
And we're going to have to wrap up for today, but I'm going to save the chat and I'm going to send out follow-up emails with slides and a link to the webinar. You'll also be able to find it on our YouTube page, 350 Colorado's YouTube page. And I hope that you can all make it to that party that I told you about so that we can all take some actions together. Thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists. I appreciate your time and your expertise so much. Let's give everybody a round of applause. And thank you all for coming. Really appreciate you.